So you've skydived before.
Yes, a number of times. To be clear, it's been a few years since I've jumped, but I started skydiving while I was working on my PhD in chemistry. And, it was just something that I initially had planned to do to take up a weekend while I was living on the central Illinois prairie, and I fell in love with it. And I've got now over 1,000 skydives and close to 100 base jumps.
Yeah. So how was it like? How does it feel to actually skydive? I've never skydived. I'm sure that some of the listeners haven't either, and it must feel fun. But hearing it from you, I think, how is it for you?
So it's different when between the first jump, the 20th jump, the 100th jump, and as you start to get more and more jumps, and it is that, at least my experience was literally the perception expanded. You have so much adrenaline and you're scared because heights is, being fearful of falling from high heights is a completely natural biological phenomenon. But as you get more skilled, you recognize the ways to deal with that and you become more conscious of different things. By the time I had about 300, 400 jumps, I was starting to do what we call formation skydives. And that's where you get together and you build formations in the sky. And I loved those because there was a challenge of working with other people. There was the challenge of organizing things so that everyone would have a successful skydive. And I also really loved doing something that was called front floater, which that means you're the first person who climbs out of the plane. You're hanging off a bar off the side of a plane at about 13,000 feet, and it's moving typically at about any place about 150 miles per hour. And you're the first one who's out there hanging off, and then a bunch of other people come out at the bar and there are people in the door. But just being that first one out there, and the things that you had to do to be in that position, I really found they fed my soul in a way that nothing else has been able to do.
Yeah, that sounds great. And so you're normally jumping from like a height of 10,000 feet, or
it varies. So about 10 to 12,000 feet is a typical altitude above ground level for a skydive in the United States of a what's called a D-licensed skydiver, and D-license is the sort of expert skydive. You can get a D license without being an expert. You've got to have 200 jumps, but that's it. 10 to 12,000 feet is the typical.
Yeah. So I like how you kind of pointed out as that it like sort of opened your eyes, like you could sort of see the whole world. And I think that being able to see the whole world today is really important to sort of be able to understand, what's going on. And I think one of the biggest things today that really happens, or that's used a lot, one of the biggest technologies, the topic of our show is machine learning and artificial intelligence. And so, the first, I guess, question that I have in specific about machine learning and artificial intelligence in terms of specifically in terms of autonomous technologies for war, is you've described this robust analytical framework for assessing the impact of new technology on national and international security and identifying policy measures to prevent or slow the proliferation of new technology, which is, I think, as you've described, the next generation of weapons of mass destructions, or WMDs, for bad intentions. So what is that robust analytical framework that you use to get a good perspective on weapons of mass destruction?
So first off, there is no single analytical framework. And that's what my research group is pursuing, is development of these old analytical frameworks. And when I say robust, what that is referring to is the fact that it has to be technologically robust, so technically correct, and that it also needs to consider geopolitics, it needs to consider the operational aspects, needs to consider what are the organizational structures that something is going to be used in, what does it look like. And then you also, particularly when we start getting into WMD, we have to consider the politics. There are very, 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 very few instances in which science actually drives decisions to make something. It's usually politics. It's usually a threat perception. So when we talk about a robust framework, it's incorporating all of those factors and additional ones. And sometimes you have to be looking, in order to assess, one has to look at specific, because there are certain things that are applicable when we're talking about AI ML that aren't applicable, for example, if we're talking about brain-computer interface, advanced neurotechnologies. So that's also part of it, is coming up with, investigating, testing, what are these different factors that are critical if you're looking at different technologies. And one thing that is different about the work I do from a lot of other work out there is that I'm not looking at a single technology. I'm trying to look across different technologies. And I'm also thinking about not just really high tech, cool, sophisticated science and technology, and even though science and technology is cool, also thinking about low tech and thinking about what is able to be adopted and adapted to large groups of people. And so that no one can perfectly check themselves. You need to have outside observers, but by looking both at high tech and sort of low tech, I'm trying to check myself, or perhaps a better way to put it, my research group, ensuring that within it we have people who can challenge, is probably not the best word, but that we can have this check to make sure that we are not incorporating assumptions in there that aren't true.
Yeah. So what, if I understand correctly, you're saying that you're basically trying to do a robust analysis of the weapon itself, and then everything that comes along with it, including, as you said before, the politics, maybe some of the science, and a lot of the other factors that play into, sort of how that weapon might affect outcomes. So I wanted to ask, like, if, for example, then how would you sort of evaluate the effect of nuclear weapons using this analytical framework? And I get that it's sort of limited, but when I say nuclear weapons, because I think you referenced that it's sort of a whole lot of things that come into play when you talk about it. But I wanted to focus on nuclear weapons in specific.
So nuclear weapons are a great example. That often is the case that things get compared to. Mm-hmm. So you're invoking nuclear weapons is spot on. I'm the heart of my research, and where I'm pushing back the bounds of knowledge, is we're looking not at currently existing weapons, but at things that might exist. Right now there is no AI weapon, but what does it look like? And then I'm most interested in, how does this impact conflict, cooperation, and politics? So back to nuclear weapons. Again, nuclear weapons are the case that everything else gets compared to. And that is because nuclear weapons fundamentally changed the nature of warfare. And this gets called the nuclear revolution. Before nuclear weapons, states, groups, whoever had them, militaries, created weapons to use them. Nuclear weapons fundamentally are defensive weapons. We keep them to have a deterrent. So that is the shift that happened with the introduction of nuclear weapons. And then this led to things called strategic stability and a whole number of different other, geopolitical terms, international relations ideas, concepts that came out of the nuclear revolution and that are still with us. Because at this point, there is no weapon that challenges nuclear weapons in terms of its importance in the world. So one of the questions that I've looked at in some of my work is there any emerging technology that has the potential to challenge nuclear weapons? And right now, if we look at, just to sort of outline 3 different cases. So if we look at AI/ML, it has the potential to affect nuclear strategic stability. It's not going to undermine nuclear strategic stability, or it's not going to displace it, but it has the potential to affect it. And it's not because, of a sort of a Dr. Strangelove kind of idea where somebody's going to have AI controlling nuclear weapons. Instead, when you think about how nuclear weapons might be affected and the strategic stability might be affected, it's, currently we have capabilities that, are known to some extent between the adversaries. There's a certain amount that isn't known. But as one uses AI/ML for targeting, for coordination, this has the potential to decrease the time for decision making. And if the time for decision making gets decreased to a certain point, an adversary may be likely to hedge. And they might hedge in the extent that they might launch an attack first. Whereas now an adversary, has some idea of what is the time that they might have to make a decision. This is limited by, the laws of physics in terms of how long it takes a ballistic missile to get from point A to point B. And this is also one of the reasons why there's concern with hypersonics. Again, it's this compression of decision-making time. So I went into that example because it also illustrates, when we're thinking about these emerging technologies, that it isn't just, there's going to be an AI weapon, some sort of generalized AI weapon. So no, you need to start thinking about it in the context of, what does this mean compared to nuclear weapons? And you hit it right on the head of what is the sort of the gold standard. How does it affect the current international politics with respect to nuclear weapons? So that's AI/ML. So I have done some work looking at some biotechnologies, and if there is a technology that might challenge the role of nuclear weapons in the international sphere, there are some scenarios that one can look to from some of the advanced biotechnologies. Now, we're not talking about anything 20th century. And also, very explicitly, when I do talk about this, I don't include concepts of operation, because I'm not going to give a terrorist or a state a recipe. So I'm very explicit to not include, here's how you make this. We talk about these things in conceptual. So AI/ML can undermine nuclear strategic stability. Biotechnology might challenge nuclear weapons. And then sort of the third case that I like to talk about is some of the advances in neurotechnology. not specifically the brain-computer interfaces, but to include those in particular where BCI start to intersect with cybersecurity, intersect with some of these other emerging technologies or emerged technologies. Those may actually have the potential to again change the nature of warfare. So we had this first change in the nature of warfare with the introduction of nuclear weapons. So neurotechnologies and the cognitive neurosciences, because of the implications, and we know that there's implications for will, for what people are choosing to do, not choosing to do. If you undermine will, and this, goes back to this, we go all the way back to Thucydides, honor, will, these basic ideas of warfare going all the way back to the Peloponnesian War. If you can undermine will and you can influence will in a different way, that again could present a revolution in warfare. So just went through 3 different types of emerging technologies and sort of outlined how they could impact geopolitics.
Yeah, so that's interesting, and I'm actually glad that I'm gonna go over these later throughout the episode. That makes me pretty excited. But specifically, I wanted to go over the AI ML sort of track. And you were, I think, talking about this idea that it has the ability to sort of decrease the time for making decisions. And I think there are already artificial intelligence systems that are being used in current warfare, in current wars. I think in Israel and Hamas, there are Israel versus Hamas. There is artificial intelligence that the IDF uses, such as the Gospel and Lavender. And I was wondering about your thoughts on these technologies that sort of, I think, identify potential targets.
So first off, we sort of have to unpack, the specific system that you noted. And we don't have insight into knowing a lot of what that is. So right now, AI is hugely hyped. For example, I have a cat. There's a automatic cat litter box out there that has AI as part of it. It's not really, but, so there's this hype. So, I'm always very careful, particularly when we're getting third, fourth party. We don't know what's being done. We don't have good insight into, is that really artificial intelligence? Is it a machine learning algorithm? What really is it? So that would be the sort of first place, is to step back and make sure that we have a really high bar when we're talking about this. And, the same thing can be said about, Russia with some of the capabilities that they have asserted that they've had. Rhetoric is part of geopolitics. And so one has to be cognizant of that. Now in terms of use of machine learning to identify targets, or lethal autonomous vehicles. We've had lethal autonomous vehicles for almost 100 years. Those are missiles, depending on how you look at it, artillery launched. Once you launch it, you can't change it. So those are autonomous lethal, vehicles. Torpedoes are another great example. So these exist. The concerns often are, is an AI system, is there going to be something in a system that is going to be making decisions about use of force? Particularly use of force that might either be indiscriminate, meaning not targeted specifically, or use of force that might be discriminate. And these are legal concepts that are part of international laws. So discriminate force, a well-trained military member should be able to shoot a rifle with some level of accuracy. That's discrimination. You should be able to target lawful combatants and not target civilians. Then there's indiscriminate weapons, and here we get back to nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are fundamentally indiscriminate. So here's this separation. So a lot of the concern that's out there when we talk about using AI and ML is this idea that you're going to use them to target and connect that to the use of force. Now, currently, there are only 2 systems that I am aware of that I have any confidence have any sort of targeting connected to a lethal system. And they are in 2 very specific situations. One is along the demilitarized zone between North and South Korea. There are some essentially posts along the DMZ which have systems that fire guns, fire rifles. So, a limited distance, but it's to maintain this DMZ. The other place where there is a system that might be described thusly is the U.S. Navy has some systems that if a intruder is able to get close to the ship, so their other capabilities fail, that these then essentially are guns that will automatically fire. Now, a couple things there. Again, distance, this is not, miles. We're talking hundreds of feet.
Yeah.
And also there's somebody who still has to turn it on the system to start. So we've gone from, artillery, torpedoes to these 2 systems that I've described that I have confidence are actually being used. So when one dives into these, there are real questions. One of the questions is, is a algorithm better than a person? And the place where most of the folks who I talk with are thinking about this is they're trying to use algorithms and AI in places where humans aren't better. So if you've got lots of data, lots of data coming in from a satellite, if you've got data that is incredibly boring, we know the limits of human beings watching screens. If you've got, hundreds of hours, a AI algorithm can detect changes better than a person. So those are the kind of places, particularly where the U.S. military and other allied militaries are thinking about and are investigating how to use things like AI ML.
Okay, so it's pretty much mainly within sort of let me rephrase, I guess. So these autonomous systems would only be within sort of places where there is data to allow the creation of models. And so would you ever even see an a lethal autonomous weapon system ever actually make a decision to kill somebody, just like along the DMZ and the US Navy? Would we ever see that in sort of warfare that involves civilians? And there's an example. I think I sent you an excerpt, and to the audience I'll play it so that you can hear it.
Early in the war in Afghanistan, I was part of a Ranger sniper team that was sent out to the Afghanistan-Pakistan border to watch infiltration routes for foreign fighters coming across the border. We drove all night and then began to hike up a steep, rocky mountain under cover of darkness. From our position on the ridgeline, we could see for dozens of miles in every direction. And by the time the sun came up, we looked down at this compound beneath us. We were basically in someone's backyard. We were certain that people would be coming to take a closer look at us. What I didn't anticipate was that they sent a little girl to scout out our position. She wasn't particularly sneaky, to be honest. She was reporting back our position, probably how many of us there were. We watched her, she watched us, and then she left, and pretty soon after, the Taliban fighters came. The gunfight that ensued brought out the whole village. And we knew that many, many more fighters would be coming before long. So we had to leave that position as we were compromised. Later on the day, we talked about what would we do in a similar situation to that. Now, one of the things that never came up was the idea of shooting this little girl. But here's the thing. She was a valid enemy combatant, and killing her would have been lawful. So if someone deployed an autonomous weapon, a robot that was designed to perfectly follow the laws of war, it would have killed this little girl in that situation. Now, I think that would have been wrong. Maybe not legally, but morally. But how would a robot know the difference between what's legal and what's right?
In that situation, I think that there was a sort of value of human life present. So then it was decided that the girl keeping her life was sort of, I guess, more valuable than protecting a position. So if we were to follow that sort of moral train of thought, how can we quantify that idea to autonomous systems?
So this is a both horrible and incredibly illustrative example. That this anecdote that this ranger shared or was shared in that New York Times article that you found. I mean, so the first piece is the way he set it up was shooting this young child would be within the laws of armed conflict. And so first of all, no. I mean, that's where you have to stop with no. It would not be permitted. Shooting that child would be a violation of the arms of law conflict. Doesn't matter whether we're talking about a uniformed soldier who's doing it or an autonomous lethal system. So that was the first piece. I said, hey, what does this say about how people are even sort of constructing these scenarios? To get to this scenario, one had to invoke something that would have been a blatant violation of the laws of armed conflict. As it was described, at least in the piece as it was retold, that child was not a lawful enemy combatant. Wasn't even an unlawful enemy combatant. There are 4 criteria, and to be sure, I am not an expert in international law. I'm not a legal scholar, but the fact that even I could look at that and go, "Whoa, hold on, this is wrong." So that's one of the there are a couple pieces that I really want to emphasize. We have to be really cognizant to be skeptical. We need to be skeptical of these scenarios that get retold. First off, the other piece, we also have to be really cognizant of the limits of our knowledge. I know where my knowledge ends. I'm not a lawyer. Lawyers sometimes get a bad reputation, but it's always good to have lawyers around if you're talking about something about international law. I mean, just the same way I've heard some lawyers talk about technology, and I'm like, dude, you need to have an engineer, you need to have a scientist, because you don't know what you're talking about. So again, because these are systems, these are situations that are so expansive. One needs to have a little bit of humility to go, hold on, I've reached the limits of my knowledge. And then also to say, hey, I know this person, they're going to be the one who's going to be able to answer that. So that, I think, went off in a little bit of different direction, but I think it's an important direction. So let's say that instead of this, civilian underage who's not being directed by a commander, let's say it was a uniformed individual who came out to do the scouting. I mean, now that changes it. Would those soldiers have been acting lawfully if they had attempted to shoot this individual? Well, again, we have to go to the laws of armed conflict. You have to do something. You don't just randomly shoot at people, especially in this situation. So this is where, these situations, to get to the question that we want to pull apart, we have to really dive into it. It has to be, I'm going to use the same word we used before, it has to be a robust scenario.
Right.
So if, we can go back to the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy has a Houthi pirate that makes it close to a Navy ship. Can they fire on them? Absolutely. If that ship is coming at them to ram, if you've got individuals who are brandishing weapons, especially if they're firing weapons, absolutely, it is within the laws of armed combat to use lethal force to defend yourself.
Right. So then basically what I'm understanding is that we only use AI where we know it can where we know that if in the event something bad happens, we know what the response is going to be, and we know how to deal with that response. And therefore we are going to use artificial intelligence because that is reproducible scenario, or it is a repetitive scenario.
Replicable.
Replicable scenario. Yeah. And so then I guess using previous patterns, you're able to go in and use artificial intelligence, I guess, in this case, and only where it is, going to happen, and only when you know what the outcome will be, then I guess it's best to use artificial intelligence in those use cases, or at least autonomous weapons. Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and I think that was pretty insightful. And I think the next thing that I wanted to talk about was sort of the future of AI in warfare. So I guess I have two questions in this direction. The first question is sort of, if we are using artificial intelligence systems lethally, where I guess we do know the outcome, would that just be limited to military situations, or will we actually see events that might be similar to the use of missiles or something like that on civilian populations? And the second question is, what types of weapons are we going to see emerge in maybe the next decade for warfare, maybe in the next 50 years?
So, I mean, the second question is a huge question that we could spend weeks, thinking about, and we wouldn't necessarily be accurate. In terms of how AI is going to be used in conflict. I mean, first of all, it is already being used in a variety of different ways, and it has been for years. So we first need to separate that. we do need to think about, looking at a state like Russia. Russia currently is pursuing an unlawful aggression against a sovereign state and is targeting with conventional munitions civilian infrastructure. Do I think that if Russia had something that they could use that had AI, that they would? Absolutely. And so here is, where you get to this piece where it's, there's what are we doing? What are we limiting? Because we, follow the laws of armed conflict, because of ethical guidelines, just because of that is who we are, versus a state that either is trying to exist outside of the international order or trying to dismantle the international order, or a state or group that has a different set of ethical framework. And in that case, it is the responsibility, in this case, I would say the responsibility of the United States and the responsibility of our allies and our partners to be thinking about that, not so that we can make the same weapons, but be thinking about that so that we can figure out ways to come up with countermeasures, so that we can come up with defensive mechanisms. Because other states, and if we get to the point where we do have non-state actors, may not have the same ethical frameworks. So this is where having countermeasures, having ways to intercept these, and those are very sort of engineering and technological focuses, are critically important. And it is also important that we use diplomacy, that we use not only, sort of traditional diplomacy, but use science diplomacy. Diplomacy itself is not a panacea, but what it does do very concretely is it often will narrow the case of what are the things you need to worry about. And that is incredibly valuable when you are trying to figure out, when you have a limited amount of resources. So, those are two approaches that I think are incredibly important: development of countermeasures and a focus on diplomacy, a focus on science diplomacy, a focus on, building norms, building relationships so that people can have these conversations. Even if, the conversations don't go where we want them to, it's always better to be talking than to be shooting at each other.
Right. I guess though, does the development of countermeasures act as an enabler to go to war? For example, let's say that X country has better weapons, etc., over Y country, but Y country, well, I guess not better weapons, but X country has weapons that country Y has the defense capabilities for, and country Y also has offensive capabilities. I mean, classically, has there ever been cases where, I guess, the development of countermeasures has actually led to war over something like diplomacy?
No. I mean, that's part of it.
Yeah.
So there's this framework that comes out of the 20th century called offense-defense theory. And it applies really well to particularly the dominant weapons between the United States and the Soviet Union in the second half of the 20th century. It's a little more problematic when we start thinking about the 21st century. But this is where it is important. Are you having something that is fundamentally defensive and that is able to be seen, able to be verified? If you have something that is if you have a system that is defensive and overt, that leads to more stability. It is when you have systems that are offensive and are covert, can't be verified, can't be counted. That's when that leads to instability because your adversary hedges. I mean, a great example is vaccines. Vaccines are countermeasures. I mean, certainly it can be difficult to assess whether or not someone has a vaccine, but these are countermeasures that make the use of certain biological agents meaningless, because you have a vaccine that decreases your vulnerability to the point where it is infinitesimal. So that's, this develop countermeasures and do the diplomacy, because it's never going to be perfect. We need to acknowledge that, perfect only happens in, like publications in a dissertation that nobody else can repeat, or Nobel Prizes. The real world, we're looking for what's sometimes called the 80% solution.
Could you go a bit more into the 80% solution?
Meaning something, whereas I mentioned before, this idea that, diplomacy does not eliminate all threats, does not make a situation completely clear, but you've reduced the situation so that what are your problems are identified. So a great example of this would be something like the Chemical Weapons Convention. Nobody who's paying attention thinks that the entry into force of the Chemical Weapons Convention has eliminated all chemical weapons around the globe. But what it has done is it has led to the elimination of 95% or more of them. And we now have systems in place where there's something like 180 inspections in the United States a year by folks from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and similarly in other states. So again, you're reducing the uncertainty.
Right.
We're never going to get to perfect. And a great example of that was Syria. Everybody suspected Syria had a chemical weapons program, but it wasn't until they started using them during their civil war, and then they made this official announcement that we knew that they had a chemical weapons program. We were able to dismantle a good portion of it. They still have a capability, but it's less than what they had before.
Right. So, okay, I get what you're saying. It's pretty much reducing it as much as you can to where, the odds may probably be in your favor.
Or at least you've made the situation one that you can deal with instead of just throwing your hands up and going, I don't know what's going on.
Right. Okay. I kind of wanted to go back to the point of just war in general and the development, I guess happens to war. You sort of said that war is like a story, I guess. Like you can influence wills and do certain things to get to certain conclusions, and it may not sound as cohesive as it's coming out of my mouth, but I was wondering if you could just kind of go into that sort of idea of human behavior and human psychology when it actually comes to war.
So, I was citing perhaps less than perfectly Thucydides. Again, this ancient, he was a theorist, a general, and he had this idea that there are these three components to warfare. You've got will, you've got honor, and that these components became crystallized in many ways. And we move ahead 1,000 years to Karl von Clausewitz, the dead Prussian general who wrote on war. This was essentially, it is now the leading theoretical framework for thinking about the nature of warfare. And he has this idea, the unchanging nature of war. It is about it's a contest between states carried out by people, usually men with guns, to influence the will of another state. So that's the nature of warfare, and it is about this contest of wills. There also are pieces about where you have to have territory because humans live on the land. We don't live in cyberspace. The whole number of pieces that one can spin out. So there's a whole literature, again, that I am not an expert on, that one can look back on these ideas, the thinking of war studies, and the emphasis is on the will of a state. Sometimes it's the will of the sovereign of a state, that once you break the will, then the adversary triumphs. And typically the way you break the will of an adversary is by, killing the community and by seizing and controlling territory. So as I was talking about in the context of another revolution in the nature of warfare, it's if one can influence the will without having to use kinetic means, guns, bombs, and without having to seize territory, then you have changed the nature of warfare.
I see. There was an example, I think Prime Minister of Germany. Sorry, I forget the name, but Kaiser Wilhelm,
Yes.
the second. I think he was the emperor from 1888 to 1918, and then I think before him he had, or under him, I guess, he had Otto von Bismarck. And I think the idea was that he was trying to unify the German states.
Yes.
And so what happened was that I think that he was so effective in the way that he did it was that he was able to contain wars. If you would even consider them wars, he was able to sort of, I guess, contain the war and expand little by little, while also, I guess, unifying Germany in a way. And I guess that I kind of thought back to that when you said if you influence, if you're basically able to do anything without fighting. I thought back to this, and there was fighting, but it wasn't on that grand scale. And I think these smaller states and these smaller, I guess, kingdoms, so to say, when they, I guess, unified Germany, everything was peaceful. And I was sort of wondering if that had anything to do with this contest of wills, if this, I guess, had anything to do with, being able to win without losing that much, without, solely by influencing psychology. And where was this influence of psychology present in Otto von Bismarck's policy?
So I am not enough of a, German or Prussian historian to be able to even speculate on that. And to be certain, this idea of being able to win without fighting certainly predates Bismarck. And one can look back to Sun Tzu, the Chinese theoretician general. I mean, one of his most well-known sort of sayings is, the ultimate victory is when you do not have to fight. So that's a little different than what I'm talking about. And he was talking about using a number of different approaches, using intelligence, certainly being a little bit using some covert action, so that you don't engage in an all-out war, which is another piece to say that it would not surprise me if Bismarck was employing some of these ideas. But again, I don't have the details to be able to say anything meaningful.
Yeah. Okay. I guess then we can move on to the next topic, which is cybersecurity. I think this one is pretty relevant. The 2024 election is coming, and I was wondering what sort of, if any, interference can we expect on the United States 2024 presidential election?
So we can certainly expect Russia to be attempting to
Right.
influence the election. We can expect forces from China. There may be, attempts to influence through social media that originate in other states. Unquestionably, there were attempts by Russia to influence the 2016 election. So yes, though that is something to be expected. I'm not even sure how much that itself is necessarily cybersecurity. That is understanding and trying to counter mis and disinformation.
Right.
And how, these narratives that take hold. I'm not sure that we're in a better place than we were in, 2014, 2015, because of some of the things that the current Congress and the current Supreme Court have done. We have seen the Supreme Court support a ruling that says that the federal government cannot share information to correct disinformation. And that in and of itself is almost Orwellian. So very concerned that our own institutions may be making it more likely that these outside actors will be more effective. And that's an indictment of ourselves, that this appears to be our own institutions, the Republican-led Congress, frankly, and the current Supreme Court that are enabling this.
Right. So it's, I guess, not really a problem on the outside, but I guess more, if you were to frame it as a problem of unity on the inside, of being able to say, okay, this is a problem and we need to address it, and we're not able to address it, I guess.
Yeah, literally, we have had instances in which states like Texas and Florida have taken the U.S. federal government to court to to make a ruling that the federal government cannot correct disinformation, cannot have Facebook, Twitter, I refuse to call it the other name, LinkedIn, whatever, that they cannot correct misinformation. So yes, there still is an external threat, unquestionably, and it is a threat from Russia, from the PRC, from other actors, certainly the DPRK. It still exists, unquestionably. Right. We have tied our own hands so that perhaps the most effective means cannot be utilized. And that's a shame on us.
Right. I also kind of want to shed some light on what Texas and Florida might be thinking. So I'm trying to like sort of get a view of both sides, and I think I mean, I'm not a constitutional expert. I don't think you are either. But from my understanding, is it possible that due to the Constitution, federal interference on private platforms would not technically be allowed? Or should it be allowed? And what kind of what should we expect from there? It's a bit of a tricky question to ask, but
Well, it is, but also we need to recognize that they're different cases. The Texas one is particularly problematic. Both of these had to do with the federal government, including under the Trump administration, parts of the federal government reaching out to Facebook and other social media companies and saying, hey, you've got disinformation about COVID. You've got blatantly false information about COVID vaccines. You might want to correct it. What the laws said was they can't even share that information with the social media companies.
I see.
So it isn't controlling, it isn't restrictive, it's even more ridiculous than that. Again, that's why I don't use the word Orwellian lightly. But these laws and rulings are somewhat Orwellian. And frankly, I think they're not very well thought. They're thought out. They were enacted with very specific partisan leanings, not thinking about situations in which what they're asking for might come back and bite them in the behind.
Right. And I guess it kind of develops into almost a wicked problem, so to say, because would it be better that private institutions have their own filtering mechanisms? I think they already do. Would it be 10 times more effective if the government was allowed to, give out information saying, oh yeah, this is false, it needs to be corrected? And I guess there's a lot of viewpoints that go into making this pretty polarizing in the United States. What I guess is Russia's ability to sort of do what it did in 2016, and I guess other countries, are they hindered by their current military operations that they currently have? Like, for example, does the Ukraine war maybe drain Russian resources and maybe slow them down from doing what they did in 2016, or is it a problem that's just completely outside of the military, where Russia's probably just hiring hackers to go and disrupt the election?
So Russia's activity in Ukraine is likely to be unconnected to their ability to conduct whether they're cyber operations or influence operations. If anything, there may be, I could come up with some hypothetical scenarios where they might actually be better, if nothing else, because they've had more time, over the ensuing 8 years to get better at it and to figure out ways to not get caught.
Right. And I guess it's this year, it's also Trump versus Biden. I guess we're kind of seeing that same pattern playing off as it did in 2020. And would we, like, I guess the question is, what Russia did in 2016 was it, like, that was a huge election disruptor. And so I guess what I'm trying to ask is it because it's Trump versus Biden this year, it was Trump versus Biden in 2020, are they able to do sort of what they did in 2020 and 2016 better, or is it just sort of the same thing that's been going through?
So the Russians, whether it was in the late 1700s under the Soviets or in 2016, 2015, 2016, they have an expertise in mis and disinformation. Maskarovka is one of the words that is one of the Russian words. They are not going to do the same thing they did before. And we would be stupid to expect them to do the same thing. They learn, they adapt. So it is not likely to look the same. So those who are trying to tackle this issue, hopefully they are thinking and have people who are more creative than even I am, who are trying to deal with this problem. In terms of, election and election integrity, we have in the United States our actual voting system, the literal process by which we vote is one of the most robust, the most resilient, in many ways, if only because there are so many different systems. There are 50 different states. In some states, like Georgia, there are 159 different counties. Each of those counties has a different system. So it just becomes a challenge of numbers. So the voting system, the actual system by which we cast ballots, is incredibly resilient. That narrative that the election outcome, was influenced by a dead Venezuelan.
Right.
That needs to be challenged and needs to be taken down and needs to be addressed. So again, some of these things are not even cybersecurity.
Right.
They're how do these people have these weird, whacked out ideas, and how do you counter them? And frankly, the person who's going to counter them is not going to be me, professor from Georgia Tech. We need to make sure that there are individuals in those communities who can speak to the people who think like this, because certainly there are a whole lot of there's a whole lot of white dudes in their 60s who aren't going to listen to any woman, and it's not going to tell so you gotta deal with it as it comes.
Mm-hmm. All right, that sounds great. So let's actually go into cybersecurity now. So I think from my research before, cybersecurity is currently defined as a wicked problem. And I'll read an excerpt from one of the sources, Inkstick. National cyber defense is an example of a wicked problem, a policy problem that has no clear solution or measure of success. The Cyberspace Solarium Commission identified many inadequacies of U.S. national cyber defenses. In its 2020 report, the Commission noted that there is still not a clear unity of effort or theory of victory driving the federal government's approach to protecting and securing cyberspace. So my question in this is, how could, at least here, what potentially is the best theory of victory that the federal government could possibly use for protecting and securing cyberspace? Is there a solution? Is it just open? Do companies have to sort of fend for themselves? What solution can we try to go towards?
So first off, Inkstick, great source there. They're a fantastic outlet. Love that you were citing them. A wicked problem is something where there is no single solution.
Right.
There are a whole number of different pieces. So one of the ones that has lately been on my soapbox is there are limitations on what the federal government can tell companies to do. To the extent that we have now seen at least 2 instances. One, the Colonial Pipeline hack. I don't know if you remember that. And then more recently, there was a hack of a healthcare system that essentially functions as kind of like the data broker between, Blue Cross, Kaiser, and the pharmacies and all these other different entities. That was hacked. And that hack of that cyber attack on this healthcare company, name I'm forgetting, probably is the largest hack ever. We don't know for certain, but up to like 1/3 of Americans' data may have been compromised. Both that hack and the Colonial Pipeline hack were done on systems that did not have 2-factor authentication. The system that I use on Georgia Tech to post syllabi, to put student grades up, I have 2-factor authentication. The fact that these companies that have data that's a lot more important than a syllabus or even student grades do not have 2-factor authentication.
Right.
I mean, that 2-factor authentication is that's like that's not great cybersecurity. That's like the bottom, the floor. So clearly what we've been doing has not been working, and these companies are not taking cybersecurity seriously. Now, I want to be very careful because there are some companies, Microsoft, they take cybersecurity very seriously. There are certain companies that take cybersecurity very seriously, but these other ones, particularly ones that are critical infrastructure, do not. And because they have not, and because there is no ability, because Congress has not authorized regulations, there's no ability to enforce that, hey, you have a minimum 2-factor authentication. Your employees, if they leave the company, you have to purge all their accounts within, 60 days. These are not onerous. These are basic ideas. Because we don't have the ability to enforce these basic hygiene ideas,
Right.
we are putting ourselves in a vulnerable state. So how do we deal with this? What we've been doing hasn't worked.
Right.
So if I was, the attorney general in Texas, I'd start suing companies.
Mm-hmm.
I think he'd much better spend his time suing these companies because this is a breach of your basic responsibility at this point.
Right.
So that's the soapbox that I am currently on with respect to cybersecurity, and that's not going to solve the whole issue, but doing that again will significantly reduce our vulnerabilities.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned 2-factor authentication, because even the platforms I use to communicate with my friends, my Google account, they all require 2-factor authentication to protect the people themselves. And I guess I totally agree with what you're saying in respect to just going on and suing these companies. And I wanted to ask then, has there been a case where these companies have either one of these companies been sued for these data breaches? And I guess, could it even be considered the company's fault for getting hacked? Where does that sort of fall?
Well, it's liability.
Right.
Again, I'm not a lawyer. So, you'd be well served to bring in a lawyer. As far as I know, they have not. but here's where you set up a system of liability. I mean, this is why we have to have insurance on our cars.
Right.
So there is an assumption that a company does not make a product, does not conduct itself in a way that is going to do harm. We can go all the way back to Ralph Nader, unsafe at any speed. This idea that companies have an obligation to not act in a way that they know is harmful. And at this point, if you are a company in 2024 who does not have two-factor authentication, you do not have any plausible deniability to not recognize that is not a minimum standard.
Right. So then I guess how can we support these, how can we support attempts to kind of get these companies to do certain things? Are there ways that we can, maybe address the general population? Are there nonprofit organizations that are working on this? Are there people lobbying in the government right now? And if so, who are they? What are these nonprofits that might be working to do these things?
Well, I'm aware of a few academics who are talking about this, and some other, folks who sort of live on the edge of scholarly thought. Beyond that, again, we've reached the ends of my knowledge.
Yeah. All right. It's a pretty good solution to just flat out sue somebody. And I guess then we can move on to I think the last topic for today, which is biological non-proliferation and counterterrorism. I think this is sort of your specialty, if I were to say. So when I was actually doing research for this, I was hitting dead ends left and right, because I felt that everything that I could find, I could simply solve using a Google question. So I just kind of wanted to start off by saying, what is bioterrorism, and what are ways that, I guess, bad actors can use bioterrorism? What are maybe viruses or biological bodies that are used currently to conduct these terrorist attacks?
Okay, so this is again a huge topic. Yeah. We could spend weeks on this. If you or any of your listeners are interested, the single best book on bioterrorism and chemical terrorism is a book called Toxic Terror. The editor of it is a individual named Jonathan Tucker. He's the editor. It's a few years old now, but it is still the best book looking at past cases of bioterrorism and chemical terrorism, some that were actual bioterrorism and some that were just sort of apocryphal.
Right.
So bioterrorism, is this idea that you have a non-state actor, a terrorist,
right,
who uses a bacteria, a virus, a toxin in some way to advance their political goals. And that's important. So you've got to use something biological, and there has to be a political goal. If you're just using it to try to kill your girlfriend, to kill somebody, that's not terrorism.
Right.
Political goal is important. It can be a single person, it can be a group of people. So historically, when people talk about bioterrorism, we often talk about the Aum Shinrikyo. And this was an apocalyptic cult in the late 1980s, early 1990s in Japan. They did successfully perpetrate a chemical terrorism attack. This was with sarin nerve agent on the Tokyo subway. Before that, they were trying to produce anthrax. They were unsuccessful. So that's one of the sort of classic bioterrorism. The other classic bioterrorism case is the Amerithrax case, the 2001 mailing of envelopes containing spores of Bacillus anthracis. There have been a number of other attempts. Most bioterrorists, most people who think they're going to try to execute a bioterrorist attack underestimate how difficult it is to do. So like the Shinrikyo, actually the Shinrikyo started off they wanted a nuclear weapon. They quickly realized they weren't going to make a nuclear weapon. Then they went to biological terrorism. They failed at that. Then they went to chemical terrorism, and that was the one that they were able to perpetrate a terrorist act with. Currently, the majority of the groups out there that we know are interested in bioterrorism are not in the United States, and they are pursuing improvised means that are not likely to be successful. So you have some radical Islamist groups like ISIL, Daesh, other groups of that ilk that have been pursuing what they literally do describe as rotting meat jars, with this idea that you try to grow up in a jar meat that's rotten to generate botulinum toxin, rotting meat jars or other toxins. Not very successful.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly not going to be a large scale biological agent. Now, in general, I tend towards the skeptical side with respect to bioterrorism. And, just again, there are other people who are good Americans, smart people, might not even be Americans, who will describe a very different situation. So I'm on the skeptical side. Also, it's very important that, you're asking me about bioterrorism, so non-state actors.
Right.
Capabilities of states is something very different.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not talking about biological weapons proliferation by states, bioterrorism. I would say that right now the bioterrorism threat is often, but not always, often incredibly overhyped. The best recourse to deal with the bioterrorism threat is a strong public health system and a strong healthcare system. And if we were to address both of those in the United States, there would be other non-terrorist related benefits. So that's, sort of that gives you a good idea on, my thoughts with respect to bioterrorism. Certainly, that does not mean that in the future there are not going to be groups that are going to be looking to try to come up with something. I see no evidence that, large language models are going to be able to significantly decrease the gap in the ability of terrorists to be able to do this. There are other things to worry about when we're talking about large language models.
All right. So you were talking about, I guess, two sides of views in accordance to bioterrorism, and you're on the skeptical side. But I'm curious to know what people on the other side might also think about bioterrorism. You said that it's not, it's overhyped, basically. It's not like it's probably, correct me if I'm wrong, it's probably not a threat.
It's something that needs to be taken seriously, but is not the level of threat that much of the rhetoric would suggest.
Right.
Now you will find people who don't know what they're talking about, who will suggest things that are ridiculous. And again, you will find good, smart people who will make the case that the bioterrorist threat is significant.
Right.
I just don't agree with them.
Okay. What might they say? What have you heard people say about that, I guess?
I mean, so there, you'll every once in a while run into somebody who thinks that, somebody is going to use CRISPR to genetically engineer some sort of biological weapon. Again, not a terrorist.
Mhm.
State as a proliferation concern, certainly of concern, not a terrorist. First of all, here's another great example of if you look at most terrorist groups, don't like to look to technology that they're not comfortable with. I mean, 99.9% of terrorists use guns and bombs.
Right.
So this small percentage, if we look at actual uses, there have been very few actual bioterrorist incidents. If you are looking across the WMD spectrum, 85% of the actual incidents of use have been chemical terrorism. And the reason that is, I would assert, multiple reasons. One, if you're going from making explosives, you can do this in your garage, you can do this in your basement. You're going from making explosives, the tacit knowledge, the capabilities to go from making explosives to making chemicals, there's a lot of overlap. To go from synthesizing explosives to synthesizing a genetically engineered biological organism, growing it up and making it such that it is not going to die when it is exposed to sunlight, that's a completely different skill set.
Yeah.
So again, it's this tacit knowledge. It's a term that gets used sometimes in academic, but that something that you can read. Anyone can read a experimental setup. That doesn't mean you can actually do it.
Right.
And again, what are these skills? So those are two fundamental reasons. One, terrorists like to use what they know works.
Mm-hmm.
Where terrorists do innovate, where terrorists innovate is in sort of their operational plans. Best example of that, 9/11. They innovated to exploit our own civilian aviation infrastructure. That's the kind of innovation they do. Not, oh, hey, can I, use synthetic biology and, nanotechnology to make a better bioweapon. No, that's not what terrorists are going to do. They do meat jars.
Right. And I guess I was, when I was doing research on this, one of the biggest things that came up was that there was, I think, a scientist or a research group early in 2000s, I think, that had managed to recreate polio without actually being, having any sort of natural roots. And the biggest thing that came up was, there was the bovine serum that they used was not like to actually attain that serum and to get it to match the conditions that were required to actually reproduce a polio virus in of itself, that required huge a lot of expertise, and not only that, but just the conditions in that bovine serum had to absolutely be right, and I totally get that, that this sort of biological thing is hard for for terrorists to do. And I think on your point about like chemical terrorism, the creation of explosives in and of itself, as terrorists do today, that is considered chemical terrorism, right?
No.
Oh, no. Okay. All right. So, all right. I see. Yeah. Okay.
So, no, but so it sounds like you were reading Kathleen Vogel's work, which is fantastic. If the first decade of the 2000s, there were two sort of experiments that are kind of the buzzword bingo of the biodefense community. One is the synthetic polio, which, as you correctly articulated, I mean, that was done. They literally chemically stitched that together.
Yeah.
A colleague of mine once described it as a stunt. I don't know if I'd say that, but again, that's one way to describe it. Polio is one of the smallest viruses in terms of length. It also doesn't have a protein coat. There are ways to get around this, but again, this is a lab, at a major research one university doing this.
Yeah.
This is not a, 3 yahoos in their garage. And then the other, buzzword bingo experiment was the mouse pox experiment that was done in Australia. And, that was this attempt to do something that had a legitimate need driving it. Essentially, they were trying to make a better birth control for mice, to put it very, just basically. And the approach that they took was to insert something called interleukin-4, the specific gene, into mousepox. And mousepox is, a cousin of smallpox. So anytime you're getting a pox, people are concerned, legitimately. But they put this interleukin-4 in, and what they found was that it was successful. It did cause the mice to become sterile. So the hypothesis that they constructed, they did, scientific method, it did what they thought. But the problem was it also ended up killing the mice, including the mice that were vaccinated against mousepox. Now, 2020 hindsight, there was some previous work that had been done that suggested that there would be this potential immune response with interleukin-4. Should the researchers have anticipated that? I'm not sure. So my look at this is it was a legitimate experiment, and there was an unexpected result. Again, is a terrorist going to do this? I mean, inserting an interleukin-4 gene into a mousepox, does that sound like something that a terrorist is going to be doing? No. Did that experiment offer insight in the context of state-based programs? That I think, yes. Then we are getting to a place where it is something worth thinking about. It is, however, a particularly good example because it is real. This isn't just notional. We know this happened. It was in the literature. So we can look at it and we can say, okay, what are the steps that could have been taken? Was there a place where somebody should have stopped this before? And sometimes you get to the end and you say, no, there really wasn't. And is this legitimate information? Did they do a legitimate, reasonable study? The answer is yes. Where it gets more interesting is, in my opinion, as I get to define interesting, there was a completely different researcher in St. Louis who purportedly repeated the experiment, but instead of using mouse pox, used cowpox. Now, you know, if smallpox to cowpox, they're like first cousins.
Mm-hmm.
Smallpox to mousepox are like third or fourth cousins. So this repetition of the experiment in a virus that is closer to the human infectious agent, smallpox, already knowing the outcome. That is one that I would say should not have been done.
Right.
The researchers never published it. I don't think they could find any place to publish it. But there's an example of an experiment that should not have been done because it did not add any knowledge to what we knew, other than to say, yeah, here's an example of what you should not do. When you know mousepox, inserting interleukin-4 causes the vaccine to no longer work, don't do it in cowpox too.
Yeah. Okay, I think that was very insightful, and I always have near the end of my episodes, I always ask my guests one question, and I think I've done this each episode, and the question is, in your opinion, do you ever think that artificial intelligence will ever be sentient?
So I'm enough of a science fiction fan that I kind of hope it will.
Yeah.
You know, it's not going to happen in the next 20 years. It's probably not going to happen in the next 50 years. But I would like to imagine a future when we have spaceships that are controlled by artificial intelligence, and they have names,
Yeah.
and they have personalities, and they are part of the crew.
Yeah, I definitely, who knows, maybe that could definitely be a possibility. But I wanted to thank you for coming and joining me in Machine Learning in the Sciences today. It was, I think, one of the best episodes and one of the best experiences I've ever had, because these are a lot of questions that I've been wondering about for a pretty long time. And I just wanted to thank you for, I guess, enlightening me about a lot of these different things.
My pleasure. You know, I was happy to speak with you, and you know, feel free to reach out to me if I can be of help again.
Yeah, thank you so much.